Another major task before you start writing your paper is basically the steps that I have outlined in the following. You need to spend the time thinking about the content of your paper. Remember, you have collected all your data, all your surveys, you know what models you've developed, what experimental results you have obtained, probably what conclusions you have reached in your research, all of that, which may be volumes and volumes of work. Set those aside, start thinking what the content of your paper should be. Once you've done that thinking, or the thought process is completed, you simply start writing down ideas in a very free form. Let's, for instance, give you an example. You have done a major research work that has looked into the impact of, for instance, some toxics in the environment, how it pollutes water, how it leads to various diseases, causes cancers. You've created data, tables, interviews that you've done with experts in the field, all of that. And it has taken you a year to prepare all that research. That's one example of the research work. You just start writing everything you've done. For instance, I looked at these toxic materials. I did this study or this research work that showed the adverse impact of this toxic substance on such and such and such areas, in the water, in the lands, and so on. I came up with these conclusions. Just jot down everything that you have done. Doesn't matter what order, what is specific results, and so on that you want to conclude, and so on. Just jot them down in a free form. The next step is to now create a general outline. What is the message that basically your paper will have? If the research was about that toxic material and its impact on the environment, you need to focus on that. What is the message you want to get across? You want to make people aware of the dangers and the risks of this use of this toxic? Is it that you want to convince policymakers that they need to invest money and resources to promote research in this area further? Is this something that you want to convince your colleagues that other research that has been done in this area has not been useful and your findings are going to reveal new basically information? So you really need to identify what the specific message of your paper should be. Also, you need to see what is the new result or contribution you want to describe, how it is different from other studies that have been done on this topic, how it is more convincing. Do you have any new results? All of those. You need to basically identify those new results. Then you need to basically find out how you really want to convince people or your colleagues, your peers in your field about what you have done, why your result is better than others. By answering these questions and preparing an outline in this way, you develop a way of thinking for preparing the methodologies or the introduction or other sections of your paper much more effectively. As you will see, I will describe those sections. Once you've done all these, then you summarize these ideas in bullets. These bullets, each of them will eventually become a paragraph of your paper that belongs to different sections of your paper. For instance, the bullet one of these bullets, it was, the material that I have discovered is toxic. That's a bullet, right? You start a paragraph now, why this material is toxic. What are the elements of the toxicity of this material? And so on. So you explain that. That can be one paragraph. Or other bullets, the adverse impact of this toxic material on water. This material not only affects underground water, but since underground water eventually is extracted and leads to be used as drinking water by people, it may lead to such and such and such. So expand each bullet into a paragraph. Now, once you've prepared these paragraphs, let's organize these bullets, and of course the expanded bullets, which are those paragraphs, in a logical structure, and develop them into a few key sentences. At this point, don't worry about the correctness, details, and so on at this point. Now, if this outline is convincing, the article that you're about to write is going to be successful. But if you cannot draw a logical pattern of thoughts and conclusions from what you have prepared in form of this outline, you should make sure that you revise that. Otherwise, your paper will not be a good, readable, convincing paper. I would highly recommend that at this stage also you make sure that you will ask a colleague to review what you have prepared in form of this outline, because that basically provides you a different set of eyes and mind to critically identify the potential weaknesses of your work and suggest to you what areas you can improve or what area you should not include or include in your paper. So this is also an important task that you need to make sure that you address. Now that you have completed all those tasks or the necessary steps, it is time to structure what you've done into categories and start writing your paper. When it comes to the structure of a paper and how you want to categorize what you've done in form of sections and paragraphs, I need to indicate that depending on the field that you're in, this categorization varies. But for the most part, at least most journals have a commonly accepted pattern or the structure for presenting your work. In particular, most engineering or science journals have the following well-accepted format that I have listed below. Your paper should definitely have a clear title, an abstract, which is followed by a few keywords, an introduction, methodologies or methods. This, of course, can be in itself not just one section, but can consist of several sections depending how extensive your research or your finding, your literature review, and so on are. So this section can be even up to 4 or 5 or 6 different subsections. And each subsection talks about, of course, introducing, for instance, your model, what the capabilities of your model does, presenting some numerical example, experimental results, and so on. This is really the core of your paper, or one of the 2 key elements of your paper. Then, of course, is the result section. Then you discuss these results, and then of course you summarize and conclude what you have done in your research. You acknowledge the sponsoring agencies or all those who have in a meaningful way contributed to the success of your research. And then you list the references at the end. These are references that you cite and you have read in your paper, and it is important to be included because they have, you have referred to them in your literature review or the introductory part of your paper. You remember that a manuscript is really like telling a story. In order for your story to be meaningful and also successful, you should have some very important elements that can convey the message of your paper in a very broad sense, even for those audience who may not be necessarily expert in your field. The strong parts of your story or your manuscripts are the introduction and the discussion. So the link between these two must be clear. Introduction is usually, for the most part, 90% consists of the work that others have done and the background or basically the landscape for presenting your work. So in other words, prepares the audience for the work that you want to present. The discussion of your paper includes, of course, what you have done that has been the outcome of your research. There should be a natural link between these two, and the link should be very, very clear. So in other words, you do a lot of literature review, and at the end, you relate those literature review to the methodologies, to the surveys you've done, and the model you've developed, and so on, and the hypothesis that you have drawn from your research, and basically convince the readers or the audience that why you've done this. So the link should be very clear. You also need to realize that the research question or the theme or the topic that is posed as the need of the introduction must be answered and addressed at the beginning of the discussion. In other words, you have proposed a new methodology, and in your introduction you have presented the argument why this methodology is so valuable and should contribute to the advancement of the state of the art in your field. In this discussion section, you need to rephrase the importance of the research that you've done or this topic or the theme. Remember, you don't have to tell the entire story. In other words, let's think of it this way. You've spent 3 years of working on your PhD. You've done tons of research. You've done a lot of work. It is very clear you cannot contain all of that in 15 or 16 pages of a journal article, which is typically the size of a journal paper. There are word limits that each journal has, and you need to be careful not to violate that. So if you have lots of information, you have done a lot of different types of research, or the scope of your research is too broad, you can always break it down into distinct categories and publish those in 2 or 3 journal papers, not only one. Now that we have discussed the overall structure and the function of the paper, let's start discussing the specific sections that each journal paper consists of, or those categories that your research paper should include, and the materials that you have done an inventory or outlined and categorized should go into these segments. Let's start with the title. The title is the first impression that the reader gets across to the reviewers or even the audience or the community. Therefore, you really need to spend the time to think very thoroughly about selecting the right title. The title is not a paragraph. It's a concise number of words that gets the message across and basically tells the audience, other researchers, that what your research is all about. So the title should include all the essential words in the right order and convey the purpose of the research work. As I mentioned, you should avoid long titles. I would recommend no more than 10 to 12 words in maximum for an effective title. In order to make your title concise, be careful to avoid redundant words. For instance, a title can be a study of a new hybrid device for seismic isolation of secondary system. Let's get rid of the redundant words. This title can be shortened as a new hybrid device for seismic isolation of secondary systems. Very concise, fewer than 10 words, get exactly the same message across. This is a typical abstract from a scientific journal. As you can see, this abstract is about 150 or 200 words. So let's just read it. Aquatic plants convert mean kinetic energy into turbulent kinetic energy at the scale of the plant stems and branches. This energy transfer, linked to wake generation, affects vegetative drag and turbulence intensity. Drawing on this physical link, a model is developed to describe the drag, turbulence, and diffusion for flow-through emergent vegetation, which for the first time captures the relevant underlying physics and covers the natural range of vegetation density and stem Reynolds numbers. The model is supported by laboratory and field observations. In addition, this work extends the cylinder-based model for vegetative resistance by including the dependence of the drag coefficient, CD, on the stem population density, and introduces the importance of mechanical diffusion in vegetated flows. Now, let's look at this abstract more closely, or dissect it. As you can see, the first sentence that I have highlighted here introduces the reader to the broad research background. In other words, discusses what aquatic plants do. For a reader like myself who have no idea about this field, by just reading that sentence, I can capture what this paper is all about. It's about the subject of aquatic plants. Then the next sentence specifically talks about this energy transfer capability and basically what it does to vegetative drag and turbulence intensity. So in other words, the first 2 sentences provide the reader with the necessary technical and scientific background about the topic of this research and what basically others have done in terms of this energy transfer. The third sentence, although it's a long sentence, specifically now talks about what the authors have done. By drawing on this link, they have developed a model that can describe the drag, turbulence, and diffusion for flow-through emergence vegetation. And for the first time, their model can capture the relevant underlying physics. So in this one sentence, they have summarized exactly what their research is all about. In the fourth sentence, as you can see now, they are specifically talking about the findings and the results of their work. They say the model is supported by laboratory and field observations. And in the next sentence, they continue demonstrating that in the work that they have done, they have extended the prior research to include the dependence of the drag coefficient on the stem population, which apparently is something new. So in this abstract, the overview of the paper is basically given to the reader. You don't have to read the entire paper to find out what this paper is all about, what the background research is in this field, what these authors have done, and what conclusions and the results have they drawn and how they have contributed to the basically field of research. So that's what an abstract or an effective abstract should be all about. The next part of the structure of a research paper are keywords. What are keywords? Keywords are typically 3 to 7 or 8 words that come right after the abstract in your paper. In other words, after the abstract, these keywords are stated. These words represent the major concept of the paper. In other words, they reflect the nature of your research and what the work that you have presented in that paper. So they are mainly used for indexing. And what that means is, since they reflect the nature of your research, they are words that you should carefully select so that when another researcher is looking, say, for your paper through a search engine, your paper will come out or your paper will appear in that search engine. Having said that, you should be very careful to use widely accepted terms. You cannot use keywords that are rarely used or only limited to the specific details of the research that you have presented. They should be words that are widely accepted within your research community or your discipline. Now, let's look at a very good example of a paper through which we will show the keywords, how they relate to the title of the paper, and also we will look at another good example of an abstract. To show you a good example of keywords, abstract, and title, I have selected a paper that was of interest to me, published recently in a journal. This is a review paper on wavelet transform. Let's not worry about understanding what the title is all about, but look at the title. The title, in a very concise way, as you can see, is talking about what the authors are presenting in this paper, Wavelet Transform for Structural Health Monitoring, a compendium of uses and features. It really captures a good overview of what this paper is all about. Since we have presented a good example of an abstract, I'm not going to spend much time going over this abstract in details, but if you get a chance and look at this abstract, you will see that again, in this abstract, the authors, in a very nice way, have talked about the value of basically structural health monitoring. Why structural health monitoring is important? Because there are a lot of structures in the world that need to be monitored. And then they talk about, in the middle of the paragraph, about their approach and why they have selected Wavelet Transform as a means to do the analysis. And in the last few sentences, they basically describe the findings and the conclusion of the paper. If you look at, in particular, the keywords, in this case, you will find a set of keywords of fewer than 10. But you look at the title. The title says, Wavelet Transform for Structural Health Monitoring, a compendium of uses and features. However, as you can see in the keywords, the authors very cleverly and clearly focus on only those terms, those keywords that are commonly used, and for a reader who may not necessarily be interested in the specific conclusion of the paper or the use of Wavelet Transform, the paper and its content clearly comes across through these keywords. The structural health monitoring. That's basically one long keyword that describes what this paper is all about. Wavelet Transform. That's what these authors are doing in this paper or are introducing, including wavelet multi-resolution analysis. And then they talk about damage detection, which is part of structural health monitoring, and signal processing that is related to wavelets. So what these keywords do in a nutshell, describe the field that this paper basically, or this research, is part of, the methodology that authors have introduced, and the context of the research. Now that we have described the title, the abstract, and the keyword, we will look at the essential components of a research paper that start with introduction. Introduction, which is the first section of any research paper, can be referred to as probably the most important section in a paper, because not only it presents an extensive overview of prior research in your field and presents basically the landscape for introducing your own research, it is also the statement of your research question, which is contained in this section. And in fact, although this statement of your research comes at the end of this introduction section, is the most important part of this section. Every reader, at least, would glance through the introduction. So for that reason also, it is a very important. Now that we have described the title, the abstract, and the keyword, we will look at the essential components of a research paper that start with introduction. Introduction, which is the first section of any research paper, can be referred to as probably the most important section in a paper, because not only it presents an extensive overview of prior research in your field and presents basically the landscape for introducing your own research. It is also the statement of your research question, which is contained in this section. And in fact, although this statement of your research comes at the end of this introduction section, is the most important part of this section. Every reader, at least, would glance through the introduction. So for that reason also, it is a very important part of the paper. As you recall, I mentioned that if you're looking for papers for literature review and for those that are related to your research, you start with looking at the abstract, conclusion, and the introduction, because those are the three areas, the three sections that really introduce the essential elements of the research that the researcher has presented. An introduction, of course, is the most extensive part. What the introduction or a good introduction section does is that it really should stimulate the reader's interest and provide the background information that is related, directly related and pertinent to that study that is presented in that paper. It is very important to write an introduction that really serves that purpose or that function. It is important to also mention that although in the introduction is where you present your literature review, but to the extent that you can, unless your paper is a review paper, you should make the literature review part very concise. You should not really extensively elaborate on every paper that you have read. You may suffice your reference or referring to those papers in the introduction in no more than 1 or 2 sentences. The references are almost exclusively used in the introduction, although sometimes in other parts here and there you may reference them, but that's where all the literature that you have reviewed are referred to. Sometimes, of course, in the discussion, you also have some references cited, but as I mentioned, the introduction section is where those references belong. References that are cited in the introduction should be those that are most valid, in other words, most accepted by the research community. They are also available, in other words, the reader can get hold of them. They're not in such a peculiar report that nobody can find them. For instance, papers that are not published yet are not good references, unless you want to refer your own work that is in print or in progress to be printed, which again, that is not really a very good practice. So you really need to also try to focus on peer-reviewed papers. PhD dissertations are also fine because eventually they will become part of the refereed or the archival volumes. So make sure that you follow these specific guidance that I have mentioned here with respect to introduction and where the references should be. The question that comes along is that, okay, how do you organize your introduction? As I said, the introduction is the most important part of the paper because it really is a statement of the research question. But now you want to know, okay, how to organize it, because, as the introduction can be, in fact, a couple of pages long sometimes, or at least about 1,000 or 1,500 word section. This is how I recommend that you organize the introduction section of your paper. You start, first of all, with the background to the topic. In other words, those literature that really set the tone about what work has been done previously and prior to what your research was completed. It is also, especially in the science and engineering field, a common practice that you use past verb tense. Now, what you should include in the early stage or early part of the introduction is what is basically known or believed about the topic. You remember that example about that abstract that we looked at, the aquatic vegetation? You really need to discuss through review of relevant literature, what is it that the community, the research community, has already accepted about your research field or the research agenda that you want to present. You also need to point out what is still unknown or problematic. For instance, it is very common that you see in the literature review part or the background part of the introduction that authors would say, so-and-so have presented such and such problem that is related to my work. However, there are shortcomings in such and such area that they have not addressed. You also need to refer to findings of relevant studies. Again, make sure that you use past verb tense. What that means is you have to be very honest. If there are work that others have done, especially those that are very close to what you are presenting and their findings, you really need to present those. It has happened many times, even to myself, that I've submitted a paper and the reviewers have criticized that why is it that although this work, which is close to the paper presented, has been published, the authors has not referenced that. So you need to make sure that you don't, basically fail in including or referring to those current work. You also need to point out the importance of the topic that you are about to address. Why is it important? What are areas that within your research community nobody has looked at it? What is the relevance, for instance, to practical applications, and so on? Then what you need to do in your introduction is make a statement of the research question. This is basically what you state in the last paragraph of your introduction, where you introduce your work and prepare the reader to read further about your research, which will be presented in the methods and results and the discussion section. So it's a very important part of the introduction. The questions that you need to ask are several. Then there are ways that can be used to signal the research question to excite the reader to become interested in the research question that you have proposed. For instance, in order to present the research questions in a very attractive and professional manner, you can say, to determine whether such model actually works in all cases of practical application, let's examine such and such. Or you may say, the purpose of this study was to overcome the shortcoming with the existing models, or to address more extensive practical applications, or to demonstrate some experimental results for the analytical work that has already been presented. Another example, this study tested the hypotheses that demonstrate the validity of such and such model in an extensive and also substantiated manner. or the purpose of this study was, or the study was undertaken to demonstrate the feasibility of such and such and such. As I said, these are typically the way the statement of the research question is presented in the introduction part of the paper. I should again emphasize the approach taken to answer the question should also be a past verb tense, especially that is the case in the case of scientific and engineering papers. And this is, of course, a brief overview of your work that will be presented in the sections to follow. There are other elements of introduction that I'd like to emphasize on, so I'd like to be very specific and take you through some key elements that are very important in the organization of your introduction or the way you organize your introduction section. Typically, the first paragraph of the introduction should make the reader interested in reading the paper. It should identify what paper is going to address, quickly bring the reader to the state of the art, and end with the general problem that is addressed by the paper. So in other words, the first paragraph, in a way, is very similar to the abstract of the paper, except that you don't get into discussing or pointing out the specifics that you have, of course, elaborated in your discussion or the results section. But it really should make the reader interested in the topic. The first sentence of this paragraph should be very broad, but would attract the attention and establish the general topic. For example, this is a very good first sentence for an introduction part of a paper. There's a long-standing interest in flow over isolated topography, such as seamounts, with regard to both theoretical and practical issues. Can you see that? The very first sentence, although it's very broad, but really captures what the overall essence of this paper is all about. Even though I am not an expert in this field of flow over isolated topography, which honestly I don't even know what that is all about, but I can immediately see what the author is trying to say is that there has been a lot of work done in this area, which shows a lot of interest that exists in the research community, and therefore tries to argue that this is an important area. That's why it is presented in the first paragraph and in the first sentence. The following sentences usually would narrow the topic. They reference other work, build up to a specific lack of knowledge that culminates in the problem statement, and then this section can vary, of course, in length from one to many sentences, depending on the nature of the research or the journal, and the limitation that sometimes you may even have with the number of words. After reading this paragraph, however, the objective is that the researcher who's reading your paper should be able to really safely conclude if the topic is applicable to this area of research or not. By following this paragraph and this approach, your article will be read by more people in the field. So let me summarize. The first sentence gives, in an exciting way, the background about the field and what your paper is going to be all about. The following sentences then will start to narrow down that broader scope of the research and focus more and more on the specific work that you have done. And toward the end, of course, you will present the objective of your own work. That way, you really excite the reader to continue and read the paper. This is an example from one of my own papers that I had written with a few other colleagues. It's a very short, in fact, paper that was published in a very prestigious conference proceedings, a referee paper. This, as you can see, let me show you the introductory paragraph and how and what role it plays. Okay, as I stated, the first sentence of the paragraph should really present the overview of the research field where your paper is basically belonging, or the areas that this paper is going to address. So let me read that. As you can see, the title of the paper is Time-Varying Modal Identification by Monte Carlo Filter. In other words, is a methodology that is going to address modal identification. So just remember modal identification as the area that this paper is going to address. Now let's read the first sentence. Mode shape-based damage indicators are one of the most promising approaches to detection and quantification of global structural damages. So in the first sentence, we have basically said, or presented to the readers, that why mode shape-based identification is so important, because it can really help addressing the global structural damages. So that immediately attracts the attention of the reader that, wow, the topic that they're going to present is very interesting, because although it's a specific technique, but it has application for addressing the global structural damages. Of course, the introduction goes on. The second sentence further elaborates what the paper is going to do. And it reads like this. To evaluate these indicators, identification of modal parameters, such as natural frequencies, damping ratios, etc., is required. Although there are a large number of algorithms for the identification of conventional modal parameters, it is still a challenging problem to identify them in a time-varying situation. So, in a nutshell, the first sentence presented the scope of the paper, and the following sentences in that very first paragraph tries to further justify, by giving more examples, more reasonings, presenting some of the existing shortcomings, areas that have not been addressed, provide a very good justification that why this field is important, and more importantly, why the approach that we are going to be presenting in this paper is going to be very important. Now let's take a look at the remaining organization of the introduction section. Obviously, after the first paragraph that we elaborated comes middle paragraphs. Depending on the nature of the journal, the limitations of the publisher, and so on, the number of middle paragraphs can vary. You can have as few as 2 or 3 paragraphs, or as many as a couple of pages. But all these paragraphs basically come after the introductory paragraph, and they mainly function as a literature review that you are presenting in your paper. As I said, the extension or the extent of this section varies by journal, by topic. They generally follows a specific format. For instance, the beginning of the literature review should cite the most important historical contributions. These come in the first few paragraphs or middle paragraphs, and then they build the foundation to the topic the paper will extend. The goal is not to cite everything, as in a review article is the case. However, to just cite those seminal contributions that directly lead the problem the article is going to address. So let's repeat. Middle paragraphs present the main body of the literature review in the paper. Depending on the nature of the journal, the size varies. Also, depending on the article, the extent of literature review that you present in these middle paragraphs will vary. In a literature review paper, you may have extensive number of references and a large number of middle paragraphs, whereas in the case of non-literature review papers, you should really need to focus the citation of the literature to those papers that are more directly relate to the problem that you're going to address, and they will also strengthen the argument for supporting your research. The remaining paragraphs that follow then would focus on the state-of-the-art knowledge and the significant differences between what has already been published and the new contribution that your article is presenting. Together, these paragraphs will basically provide another guiding principle. The literature review identifies the seminal historical contributions, outlines the state of the knowledge, and justifies the novelty of the article's contribution. Remember, that's really a key element of these middle paragraphs. The literature review should be based on refereed journal articles, as I stated before, to the extent possible. Conference proceedings can be referenced where there is no basically journal paper published in that area. And sometimes, of course, there are conference proceedings that are refereed, and they're a very good source of reference for citation. Websites may be referenced where they present a very unique multimedia-oriented content. Reference to websites is very common, in fact, in some fields, such as computer science. But in the general area of the sciences and engineering, they are rarely used, although increasingly they are becoming more popular. Remember that the non-refereed materials do not bolster an argument. You really need to refer to sources that are widely cited, written by established and respected authors and researchers, and they have appeared in refereed journals. Therefore, the literature review gives credit to our predecessors and justifies the need and novelty of the article's contributions. After the introductory paragraph and all those middle paragraphs that are mainly focused, and I emphasize mainly focused and serve the purpose of presenting the literature review and lead to presenting your work and the background that is specific to your work, comes the final paragraph, which I refer to that as a roadmap paragraph. Why do I call it a roadmap paragraph? Because it outlines the remaining sections of the paper. It can either give a very general outline of the contribution or a very specific section-by-section breakdown of the remaining article. So remember, the final paragraph or the roadmap paragraph is where you now have the first time opportunity to present a very strong case for your research and explain that the rest of the paper is going to elaborate what you have stated in this roadmap paragraph. As I said, the way, of course, this research statement is presented varies depending on the discipline and depending on the nature of the journal and so on. In the engineering and scientific field, mainly this final paragraph is typically no more than one paragraph because you leave the explanation and justification and elaboration of the research and the detailed work to other sections that would follow. But let me, for instance, present two examples here. This is an example. In addition to the theory, we present results from numerical simulations. These are done in order to examine whether the predicted stable flows can arise naturally as a result of the time-dependent evolution. As the initial condition, we use various non-stationary vortices near or on top of a seamount. We also revisit two-dimensional turbulence over a bump. The simulations are broadly supportive of the theoretical predictions, although time dependence can produce interesting final states. Look at this paragraph. What it has done, it has really captured the essence of everything that has been presented now in the literature review, and now is building upon that and making the statement that the authors, in addition to presenting the theory that they have developed, they are also going to present the results from the simulations that have resulted from the numerical application of these theories. And they also argue and they present the fact that in order to present the specific results, they are going to look at a number of different cases, a two-dimensional case, and also their simulations that they're basically presenting are going to support a much broader examples and the cases for the predictions that this model is capable of. Okay? Another example. This is an example in which the last paragraph is broken down into specific sections that explain the remaining part of the paper and how your research work is presented. For instance, Section 2 introduces models for drag, turbulence, and diffusivity for flow-through emergent vegetation. Laboratory and experiments described in Section 3 provide observations which support these models. The comparison of model prediction and experimental observation is given in Section 4. Finally, the models are used to compare the mean flow, turbulence intensity, and diffusivity in vegetated and unvegetated regions in Section 5. So you can see the difference. In the first case, the authors give a very broad overview, the way the research is going to be presented in the rest of the paper. And in the second example, the author is very specific. It addresses the specific discussion that are going to take place in each forthcoming section of the work that is presented in the remaining part of the paper. I should also indicate that the final paragraph, or the roadmap paragraph, serves two other important functions. First, it puts the complete contribution of the article in the context of the previous contributions, thereby emphasizing novelty and the extent of the new contribution. Second, it guides the expert reader who may want to skip sections of your article to the sections that interests him or her the most. Thus, this is really the final principle for the introduction. End the introduction by outlining for the reader the specific contribution of the article and tell the reader the overall organization. That's all that this final paragraph, or the roadmap paragraph, is all about. To conclude the introduction and show you an example of the final paragraph, let me present to you an example from my own work again. This is the same paper that I presented earlier, and through that I demonstrated a very good example of an introductory paragraph. And now I'd like to use the same paper and demonstrate a very good example of an ending, or the roadmap paragraph. You remember the paper was talking about time-varying modal identification. Forget about the rest. That's the focus of the paper. Okay. Now, in the introduction part, in support and justification of presenting our new approach, we presented an extensive literature review, and it comes now to the final paragraph, and this is how basically we are ending this introduction section. Let's read together. In this paper, the Monte Carlo filter smoother is adopted to solve the nonlinear non-Gaussian estimation problem. The Monte Carlo filter smoother is certainly one of the most powerful approaches for these types of problems, which can handle arbitrary types of nonlinearity and arbitrary non-Gaussian densities. Although the examples investigated in this paper are just preliminary ones, it is expected that this flexibility of the Monte Carlo filter smoother may provide our identification method with great usability for a wide range of future applications. Look how in one paragraph, after presenting literature after literature in this related field, we are presenting a very strong case that what our model is going to do, what its capabilities are, and what promises it offers for the future research in the field. With that example, I would finish the section on introduction, and we will move to the next section of the research paper. The next section of a research paper after presenting the introduction is the methods section. This section usually and often comes disguised with other article-specific section titles, but it serves a unified purpose, which is to detail the methods used in an objective manner without introduction of interpretation or any biased opinion. Let me, of course, indicate that when we refer to the methods section, this is not necessarily one section or a specific number of paragraphs. The method section, which basically includes the heart of your research and the methodology that you have developed, or the survey that you've done, or the experimental, analytical, numerical research that you have carried out, and the result that you've accomplished, it presents that, can consist of a number of subsections depending on the nature of your work. For instance, if your research consists of both experimental and theoretical research, you can devote a large section for the methods, or presenting the methods, devoted to the theoretical part of your research, and another large section to the experimental results of your section. But as I said, you will present your research work without making any specific interpretation or opinion. It should be a very honest presentation of the work that you have carried out. The section should basically tell the reader very clearly how the results were obtained. Did you use a computational scheme, or you carried out experiments? What kind of experiments? You should be very specific. They should also make adequate reference to accepted methods and identify differences. For instance, if you've carried out an experiment using certain type of equipment, you should indicate why you have specifically selected this type of equipment over the other type of equipment. Why have you selected this kind of sensors over another sensor or detection mechanism for carrying out your research? You really need to justify that without really bashing others. You just present the facts. The governing principles that you need to follow in the methods section is to make sure that you describe all the techniques used to obtain the result in a separate, objective method section. As I indicated earlier, if the paper develops both an analytical model and laboratory results, or theoretical and experimental results, you should write separate method sections for each of these areas. At the conclusion of the method sections, the reader should be able to form an educated opinion about the quality of the results to be presented in the remaining sections of your paper. So remember again that the method section captures the essence of the research that you've done. You present it with the full details, including the type of equipment used, the approach you use to conduct your surveys or data collection, theoretical modeling, and so on. And by the time the section is completed, or the reader has completed reading this section, he or she should have a very good idea about the nature of the research that you have presented and what is it that you are going to present in the following sections to really further justify and demonstrate the validity of the research that you've carried out and you have presented in this section. Let's present examples. A method section, as I mentioned, can be just one or two paragraphs, or can be in one section, or can be subdivided into a series of sections. For instance, these are typical examples of sections of methods from a paper. As you can see, the methods, or where the research is presented, is contained not just in one section, but in section 2, section 3, and section 4 of the paper, that in fact, one of these sections even has subsections. That's section 2. Let's read. Section 2 presents physical and mathematical consistency of the Weber-Bauk-Wen model. Subsection 2.1 talks about the physical consistency, and section 2.2 talks about the mathematical consistency. Then, in the following section, which is still part of the methods section, the description of some of the specific features of the research are presented, the hysteresis loop. In the following section, which is again part of the methods section, the variation of the hystereses are presented. In other words, how the model that is presented in the previous section is further elaborated. Let's look at another example. In this example, the method section consists only of a large section with a few subsections. So the section is titled Theory. In subsection 1, Theory on the conservation laws and variational principles is presented. In subsection 2.2, flat topography or circular seamount is presented. In subsection 3, irregular seamount, and in subsection 2.4, some comparison between the theories that are presented by the reader, by a previous researcher, and the reporter are presented. So, as you can see, this is an example that the method section consists of a single section. This is an example that the method section is broken down into a series of sections, each of which addresses the specific approaches that are used in your research to present your argument, to present your research, and build a ground for presenting the results and further discussions. Once you have presented the methodology that you have used in your research to carry out what you have done and to obtain the results, you present the section on the results. So, as the name sounds, and it is obvious from it, the results section and the following discussion section allow the most flexibility in terms of the organization and the content. This is where you're going to present your results. No one knows better than yourself what results you have achieved, how many studies you've done, how many experimental work, what field tests you've done, what numerical results you have performed, what experimental and laboratory results you've obtained. These are what you have done in your research that you are proud of and are the evidence of the validity of your research. So, in terms of the organization of this section, you are very flexible. You can present it in any which way, literally any which way that you want. In general, though, the pure, unbiased results should be presented first, without any interpretation. These results should present the raw data or the results after applying the techniques outlined in the method section. The results are simply results, remember. They do not draw any conclusions. Let me be specific. Let's say you have developed a mathematical model that can predict the behavior of a specific type of structure, if of course that is a scientific research. Or you have developed a hypothesis or a theory that in fact demonstrates how the population in China is going to evolve in the next few decades. That is the research you've carried out, that you've presented in the methods section of your paper. What you will do in the results section, you are now going to demonstrate basically the validity of the method that you've developed. You want to, in the case of that scientific paper, you want to demonstrate through some numerical example how that mathematical model that you have developed can be applied to a wide range of cases and prove that your model works in all those cases. In the case of that China example, or the population growth, you want to demonstrate in this section that how you can, by using the methodology that you had introduced before, predict how the population in China is going to grow in the next few centuries or the next few decades. That's where the result basically is all about. Remember though, often the results are combined with the discussion section, especially in the scientific and engineering papers. That is always, or most of the times, the case. This makes, of course, their interpretations and suggests implications. When these are presented in one section, there should be a very clear distinction between a result and discussion. This could be done by paragraphing, by section headings, or by careful writing within a single paragraph. Let me again give a specific example about that scientific approach. Let's say you have developed a mathematical model that can be used to predict the damage that takes place in a structure when the structure is under the action of earthquake excitation. In the result section, if you have combined it with this discussion, this is how you present your results. You would say, the mathematical model that was presented in the previous section is applied to a case that a structure was subjected to an earthquake excitation with a magnitude of 6 Richter scale. These are the results that we obtained, and the figure such and such demonstrate how the structure behaved under such excitation. See, although the result and discussion section are combined, you have so far only presented the results. Now you would continue by saying that, as tables such and such demonstrate, this model is capable of predicting the behavior of the structure in a much more precise manner than the models that had been developed by other researchers. See, here you are reaching a conclusion and presenting the conclusion of the results that you have developed based on your methodology to the reader. So let me emphasize, the main purpose of the results section, however, is to provide the data from your study so that other researchers can draw their own conclusions and understand fully the basis for your conclusions. The discussion section is where the article interprets the results to reach its major conclusions. So this is really the sweet part of your paper. This is where you really present what you are proud of, what makes your research work truly stand out. This is also where the author's opinions enter the picture. That's, in fact, exactly where your opinion, your pride, your achievements are presented in the research paper. The discussion is where the argument is made. Often writers combine the discussion and the results, as I said before, so that they can avoid repetition and so that they can also give their conclusions parallel with the results. This is acceptable, as I said, especially in the scientific field, if there maintains a clear distinction between facts and opinion. Let me emphasize over and over and repeat myself. If there remains a clear distinction between facts and opinion, sure, you can combine the results and the discussion section. Most scientific papers, however, require the results and discussions to be in separate sections. A common feature of the discussion section is to compare the measured and model data or make a comparison among various modeling methods. This is really especially the case when you have done scientific work that involves theoretical work, you've developed a model that you have applied to some experimental cases, and you want to make argument about the legitimacy of your work or the superiority of the work and the results that you have achieved through your research. Consider the following question. How the results compared with earlier work? What is new and significant? Another common element in the discussion section applies the results obtained to solve a very specific engineering problem. This is in the case of course, an engineering work, which is my field, so you can, I'm sure, immediately see where my bias comes in. Some journals, for example, the Journal of Hydraulic Engineering, even require a separate application section for this purpose. In other words, in the case of engineering, some of the journals go even deeper. In addition to the discussion section, they expect you in some specific fields to also demonstrate the discussion through some specific application of the arguments that you have made in the discussion section. But the main features of this discussion section are summarized as follows. Discussion sections interpret the results to reach the main conclusions of the article, and the discussion section is the main impact section where the researcher has the most freedom to tout the implication of his or her own research. A word of warning, however. Never make an assertion of which you are not 100% sure. I have seen this before, believe me you, that people have done that. Do not open a can of worms. Do not open the door for a negative review or the eventual rejection of your article. That's why I emphasize that in the results section, be as objective and as neutral as possible. And as a rule, it is better to be conservative. Most of the experts who read your article will draw their own conclusions anyway. This section allows you to highlight the conclusions you think are important, but not go over and over and over and toot your own horn. Let's put it simple. Don't too much brag about what you've done. The discussion section is not about bragging about your work, but it is simply presenting the validity of the results which demonstrate the workability or the outcome of the research that you have done. The last and final part of a research paper, or the essential part of a research paper, is a section which is usually referred to as a summary or the conclusions. This final section does not introduce any new information or insights. As the name or the title goes, it merely summarizes. It merely summarizes and concludes. That's what this section is all about. This section is typically longer than the abstract and generally includes more specific conclusions. Don't make a mistake. You're not presenting a discussion here. You're only making precise and very brief conclusions about the outcome of your research based on everything that you have presented in all the prior sections of the paper. So it is often more quantitative than the abstract. However, listing equations or citations should not be necessary. And that is, of course, the case with the scientific or engineering work. A very good format for this section is to write it in 2 paragraphs, and no more than 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph will summarize various sections of the article, and the second paragraph draws the important conclusions that you've already presented elsewhere, but it really summarizes that in a very concise, very few sentences. The summary paragraph is different than that at the end of the introduction section. Here, the summary paragraph draws on the fact that the reader knows all of the new results presented in the article already. It then summarizes what the important results were. Remember, it summarizes. The conclusion paragraph, in other words, identifies the significant conclusions. There are 2 possible formats for the second paragraph in the conclusion, if you have written your conclusion to be consisting of those 2 paragraphs. Organize this concluding paragraph based on logical flow for points that are interconnected, and organize based on merit, where the most important items appear first. These are 2 approaches. You can choose either one as you prefer. Remember, this paragraph should not present new information. I may sound repeating myself, but it is important to remember that conclusion is not where you present any new information or repeat information. It may combine parts of the article to underscore an important conclusion, but it cannot present information that could not be gleaned from other sections. A third, sometimes optional paragraph may identify future research directions that flow naturally from the article. It is very natural that in the conclusion section, you encourage other researchers to continue the research work that you have presented to address the shortcomings of your work or areas that you have not addressed in this paper or others have not addressed in the current literature, and so on. The guiding principle for the summary and conclusion sections are that the summary and conclusion section tells the reader what has already been read and draws the important conclusions, keep it short and make it as specific as possible. If the reader wants to know specifically what aspects of the problem your paper will address, he or she will often read the introduction and then the summary and conclusion sections. Hence, it is important that all of the significant findings are summarized and united in the significant conclusions, and follow these guidelines and your papers will have the maximum impact and receive, believe me you, the most positive reviews that your work warrants. The next part of a research paper is a section on the acknowledgements. The acknowledgements are usually given at the end of the research paper and should contain, as a minimum, the sources of funding that contributed to the article. You may also recognize those individuals, colleagues, peers who have contributed to the article or the data contained in the article, but at a level of effort that does not justify their inclusion as authors. For instance, Department of Transportation or the police department or an agency may have provided you data that you have used for your research. Those sources should be acknowledged. And of course, obviously, the funding agencies who have sponsored your research work should definitely be acknowledged. The next section that is not typically the case in every paper is a section of the appendices. The appendices are mostly common in science or engineering papers, but they may also come in other fields. This section is basically included in a paper if needed, and in that case they're usually listed after the acknowledgement and before the references. An appendix typically complements the contents of the paper by presenting details that should not be included in the main body, since they may distract the readers. For instance, detailed mathematical formulations, a survey poll, a large number of data that you have referred in your results section or the discussion section, a detailed description of how a material is made, and so on. As I said, in summary though, appendices are typically rare in most research papers, but the purpose that they serve is to contain information that is so massive that cannot be included in the main body, yet they may be important. The references is the last section of a research paper. All the reference work that are cited in the paper must appear in a list of references that follow the formatting that is usually follows the requirements of a specific journal in which the article is to be published. You may not include references that you have not cited in the introduction or the literature review of your paper. And refereed journal articles, research monograms, and books are preferred over less stable or reliable sources, such as personal communications, unrefereed conference proceedings, or website addresses. Remember, references also signify the importance of the work that you've done. So if you refer to important work that are reported in the literature, that shows that your work has used very reliable sources and has tried to address those areas that are important within that discipline or the field of research. We have now concluded the short course, and I hope by now you have developed a very good understanding of how to write a research paper by getting prepared, organize your work, and follow the step-by-step procedure and the sections for writing an effective research paper. Now, let me summarize what I presented in the course, or basically a quick overview of the materials presented. So this will be a refresher for you and help you better understand and absorb what I presented through this short course. In this section then, I would like to present a general outline of a journal article that I articulated more thoroughly through this short course. The first part of any research paper, or specifically a journal paper, is the title. Title is what captures the immediate attention of the reader. The first main component of the paper is the abstract. Remember, the abstract should inform the reader in a succinct manner as to what the article is about and what the major contributions are that are discussed in the article. Then comes the introduction. Introduction consists of an introductory paragraph that starts with an attention-getting broad statement that establishes a general topic for the article. We'll narrow the topic in successive sentences that outline the state of the art and introduce a gap in knowledge, and end the introduction with a general statement of the problem and optional supporting or specifying statements. Then are the middle paragraphs. The literacy review identifies the seminal historical contributions, outlines the state of the knowledge, and justifies the novelty of the article's contribution. The final paragraph, or the roadmap paragraph, ends the introduction by outlining for the reader the specific contribution of the article and would tell the reader the overall organization of the paper that would follow. After that comes the methods section or sections that describe all of the techniques used to obtain the results in a separate, objective, basically manner. After these method sections are the results. The results should be clear, convincing, and general, and should be free from interpretations or opinions. Then the discussions. Discussion sections are where you interpret the results to reach the main conclusions of your research and the article. In the summary and conclusions, You tell the reader what he or she already has read and draws the important conclusions of the paper. Keep it short, make it as specific as possible. Acknowledgement is where you acknowledge all those who have helped you achieve the results of your research, and appendices, if they are needed, are those sections that contain complementary part of your work that you cannot include in any of the sections of your paper, because otherwise it would distract the readers from the main points presented in your paper. And the last section of the paper are the references. The references section lists all those literature that you have cited in the paper, and you want to focus on important literature that you have reviewed, preferably refereed articles. A final word before we conclude this short course. Before submitting your paper to a journal or to an archival volume, revise and edit your article as if you are not the one who has to do all the work. Meaning, be ready for a relatively painful process, which is worth it. If you do that, I can assure you that the review process of your paper will be much more fruitful and you will more enjoy the outcome of that review. I have provided a recommended template for preparing a manuscript on my website at no cost, and you can reach that by visiting my website that I have listed below. At this point, let me thank you for your attention and listening, and I sincerely hope that you have learned the necessary tools and those techniques that you need to prepare your research paper, whether it is the first time you are writing it or you're going to use that to enhance future papers that you will be submitting to a journal or to wherever source that you publish your work. Thank you.